Hi, this is Beet with Joe, and you're listening to Joe Mountford. The show is about mental health for athletes and coaches, and all the support staff and those who are passionate about player wellness. As a CliftonStrengths coach, therapist, and mindfulness coach, I interview professional athletes, coaches, and all those who are working with them. I believe that mental health is vital for performance. This includes the mental wellness of coaches, management, players, and parents. So subscribe now to stay connected. I'm fortunate enough to have Garreth Ewing joining me for the second week. He was a former SA men's hockey coach. Garreth coached the men's hockey team from 2019 to 2022, taking them to the Tokyo Olympics, the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham, and some FIH Pro League tournaments. We last spoke about mental health of the coach, where Garreth shared his own journey. You can listen to this or watch it on the Beat It with Joe YouTube channel. So I'm now going to bring in Garreth. Welcome, Garreth.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for having me again.
Yeah, thank you for joining me again. I was just saying that the last time we spoke, we were talking about mental health for the coach. And today we're going to be talking about the relationship between the coach and the players, which I think is a vital formula for success.
Absolutely. And I think that relationship is a special one, and it can potentially be a fragile one. So it's also something to really consider, and within the wider mental health context is obviously also really, really interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So on that, if I were to ask you, what unhealthy habits do you think coaches tend to, if things are not going well and if they're under huge pressure, how do you think it can be a negative response, or it can develop a negative relationship?
Coaches have to be careful of playing a blame game, either blaming themselves too much, or worse, probably blaming players, and then kind of, projecting their frustrations onto the player, whether that's with unkind words or a negative selection reaction, or a knee-jerk reaction in terms of what you're now going to train and what you're going to follow through, and leaving the process behind and trying to fix things in the short term. So, keeping the emotions there, because emotion is part of sport, but keeping it in check and not letting it take over the situation.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying is vital. So if the coach is mentally healthy, they will have a variety of emotions: happy, glad, sad, excited, angry, grumpy, stable. If the coach is not in a good mental space, is there a chance of, I call them, having concrete emotions where you can come across as a bit dead? Emotionally numb. Let's call it emotionally numb rather than dead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of that comes down to how connected you feel to the process. So if your survival mechanism in that particular stress moment is to retreat, or to try not to overreact, you could end up becoming emotionally stunted in that space. And then it becomes harder and harder for you to express yourself. And then the athlete starts to see you as shut down, and then they become colder and colder to you, and you lose that trust relationship. Trust can be built, takes months to be built, but it can disappear in an instant, one thought or action. So I think that idea of, as you say, concrete emotions getting stuck in a loop of negativity or retreat makes it harder and harder then to communicate and problem solve as a group.
Yeah. So I think it's the lack of accessibility to you as a coach. So if the player doesn't feel that you're accessible, then it creates a bigger gap. And if the coach is not emotionally stable or consistent, it also provides anxiety and an unsafe space for the team.
Yeah, I think that there's two extremes. There's the extreme of the coach having these over-the-top emotional responses where everything's a disaster and everything is finger pointing and blaming other people, and then going the other way where the coach is unapproachable and unengaged. And in fact, in both spaces, the coach becomes unapproachable because the response is going to be out of proportion. To keep that consistency, to keep that accessibility is sometimes very difficult, but it's extremely important.
Yeah. Okay. So my next question, or I was going to say, we spoke about last week that, say you came back from a meeting and you've been loaded with negative news or something that's going to carry heavily on you. And so we know that players are both listening and watching you. And so how do you think that energy impacts the practice, their performance, their sense of security?
Yeah, I think there's two elements at play there. The first one is the simple response to your body language, tone of voice, what kind of mood you bring to training, whether you're under a cloud or whether the sun is shining in your eyes. That can be really important. And obviously, if you come in with tension, that's going to create tension in the group. Linked to that as well, I think, and the second point is that communication is so important. And if they look at you and they think, well, you must have just got some bad news, they're going to start to assume negative things and they're going to assume the worst. And it becomes an obstacle in terms of communication, because perhaps it's something you do want to speak about, but you don't want to do it now because you don't want to make the mood even worse. So you end up, holding it in and carrying it around during the training session. And again, that affects the mood. So again, people are always listening to you. You're always the coach and you're always coaching. So even if it's at breakfast or it's off the pitch and they see you in a negative frame of mind or negative body language, that is going to rub off on them. And it's probably one of the hardest things to do. For me personally, it was, as a coach, is not to carry that around in a space where players can pick up on it. Sure.
And I think we spoke about it last time too, is developing self-awareness. It's being connected to your body and connected to your mind on how you're feeling, so that you know how you present yourself, or that you need to debrief somewhere else, or whatever the case may be. But having self-awareness gives one choice. And then another thing I think we can share, both being CliftonStrengths coaches, doing the CliftonStrengths so what happens is, just so that the listeners can hear it, is the team members do their strengths. And what that does is it gives the coach and a better understanding on how the players can be the best versions of themselves. You spoke about communication earlier on. If the coach has also done his CliftonStrengths, the team members understand how the coach can be the best version of themselves. And it just opens up communication channels on a much clearer level. What do you think about that as a coach yourself? As a CliftonStrengths coach yourself?
Look, I'm a huge fan of CliftonStrengths, and I think the most important thing in this team sport context is it gives everybody a deeper understanding of how the individual operates and how the individual operates within the team. My colleagues, Mick Todd, he always says, high-performing individuals are not well-rounded, but high-performing teams are, because you fill in each other's gaps and you round out each other's spikes. And I think that's a really interesting way of thinking about it, and just that understanding of what each individual brings to a space. And obviously it's not always that easy when you're dealing with a large number of people, but being able to identify, well, this is what this person is going to bring to the table when they're not at their best. This is where they're going to be struggling, and this is how I can fill in the gaps for them. And that becomes really powerful. And it's just really a tool of creating a deeper knowledge of each other as a team. Really powerful, something for people to do some research into. It's just another way of building the trust and creating a space where people can thrive.
Yeah. So I had the opportunity to work with the SA ladies team, and what we did, which was so amazing, is we broke up into little groups. And what it does is it allows you to communicate to others your why. This is the way I behave, and this is the reason why. And it's in that miscommunication that attention is lost. One loses focus on the goal. So, but what's also important, we're talking about player, team, and coach. It's the coach, therefore, understands why players behave the way they do and how to get the best out of them on and off the pitch.
And I think there's two aspects to that. There's the self-awareness aspect, where you are understanding your strengths or your lesser strengths, and how that impacts on you as a person in specific situations. And then obviously the greater team knowledge, where you understand how and where you fit in. And those two things working together are really important, because it also really contributes a great deal to the trust environment, in terms of understanding that sometimes what you see from somebody is not them being deliberately obstructive or aggressive. It's just how they respond based on how they are wired. Yeah. And that understanding is something that, again, when I have the opportunity to do this again at a high level, I'm definitely going to build this into my trust building framework.
Yeah, you mentioned the word trust quite often. That's a huge part of your coaching philosophy, am I right?
Very much so. From the point of view of creating an environment where everybody feels safe and part of a greater process, and also in terms of being able to and willing to show vulnerability to each other in terms of how you communicate with each other and how you express your feelings. It's an interesting process. Did I always get it right? No, but it was always something I was striving for, and the moments of clear trust that we did get right, it was very obvious to see and very powerful.
Wow. Yeah, because it creates a secure environment. And I think you bring up something, and in a man's world, and not a man's world, in a man's team, I think vulnerability is often frowned upon. And I think it's in being vulnerable that people can grow and develop and accept and be closer.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the the lessons that I learned is that it's really got to be worked at. Doesn't always come naturally, and it's very fragile. So trust, as I said, can be eroded very quickly, whether that's through a willful action or an inadvertent action or word. It's something you've got to work at, and you've got to understand its process. I was very lucky to have some really good professionals in the mental and performance space working with me on this, and it was conversations that we had over and over again. And I think that, again, there are times when it was very successful, and there are times when we realize we have to keep working at it. But it's got to be that human element coming through over and over again.
Yeah. But Gareth, it's everybody's responsibility to work on it. Do you agree? So
100%.
Yeah. So when I say that if the coach is out of control and he's the role model and he's losing it on the side of the field, then it makes it okay for the players to also be losing it on the field, and then you get cards, etc., so that the knock-on effect impacts the team. So everybody needs to be heading in the same direction with the same responsibility. Yeah.
Agreed. Just the same as one player can erode trust in a whole group if he doesn't bring that buy-in. The coach as well can erode that trust if they're not consistent and regulated in terms of their response to situations, and understanding where their energy goes and what that energy looks like to people in the dugouts and people on the field and people up in the stands. So yeah, it's a very fluid situation, but you're 100% right. It's got to be everybody all the time.
Yeah.
And as much as we said earlier, understanding people are going to have their ups and downs, and the trust that people will always come up again is important to know, but it's got to be consistently applied all the time, even if it's not something that you're feeling at any given time, or it's not something that you feel 100% behind in any moment. You've got to keep working at it until it becomes a bit more natural.
Yeah. And I think one area that can break trust is not break trust, but maybe rattle a relationship is, I'll give you an example. I know someone who is in the SA team now, and she eventually went to her coach at school and said, "Why do you never say to me, congratulations, well played?" And her coach said, "Because you always play well." And so my question to you is going to be around expectations. So is it possible to give attention equally? And I'm sure the answer is no. And then the expectation is like, if they are that good, are there expectations to compliment them or not? Or what are your expectations? Do you know what I mean? And you understand what I'm saying? It's like, okay, first question is, are you able to give players attention equally?
So I think it's an interesting example that you use there, and it's something I'm really engaging with at the moment, is how you give praise and why you give praise, and what words you use. And something that I've been learning about a lot recently is the power of noticing. So I noticed that you did this really well in the game. I noticed that you slapped the ball really well during the game, as opposed to going, well played. Give somebody a little bit more focus, and it's a little bit more specific, and it gives them a message that you were genuinely seeing them. You weren't just giving a generic response. That said, I still think more on the side of too much praise than too little. But again, that becomes quite difficult when humans are essentially wired for negativity. It's a survival mechanism. So we're looking for things through a jaded lens rather than looking at them massively positively all the time. So it's a tough one. I know I've been guilty of doing exactly that. You praise the players you consider to be your top performers in different ways to the players that you think are going to benefit a little bit more from a little bit of a pick-me-up or a push. So I think it is hard to give equal attention, but I think if you're very mindful about it, then you can be better at spreading the praise and spreading the encouragement around, but it takes work.
Yeah. And I think it's a conversation that needs to be had with each player. So it's that expectations conversation. So from the player's point of view, having the conversation with the coach, these are my expectations of you. And then the coach saying the same conversation back, because it's the same conversation about if you're in the starting lineup or not. Some people, if they feel that they're at their best in the starting lineup and then suddenly they're not, these are the conversations that'll either make or break confidence for some. But when I talk about those expectations, you gave the best when you said, "I won't compliment a fish for swimming." How does that saying go?
Yeah, don't praise a fish for swimming, and it does come across as a little bit cynical as well. But at a high performance level, there's an expectation of a certain level of performance, and to praise a person for performing at the level, for me, is potentially a waste of energy, rather than giving energy where praise is going to improve that performance, or to mark out something that was done really, really well in a particular moment. So it's a tough one. I'm not sure in my current frame of mind that I would necessarily use that sentence as often as I perhaps would have in the past. But it's it's interesting because, again, depending on your level, there's an expectation of performance.
Yeah.
And a lot of it comes down to communication, and, as you say, an understanding of that expectation. And I think there's another thing I would do differently is I was quite good, I believe, at telling the athlete what I expected of them, but I don't think I often enough said, what do you actually need from me? What can I give you to help you meet these expectations? So that's a process I'm engaging with in my head, and something that, again, when I get this opportunity, I'm going to modify and learn from. But, expectations are huge. And again, talk about communication, but what I say and what the player hears are sometimes two very different things.
Yeah, and I think if we go back to CliftonStrengths and we look at someone, if they have achiever in their top 5, and you look at that, they would benefit hugely if they set goals per practice. And if they were able to have that conversation with you in the practice, saying, listen, this is my intention for the practice, and I'd like to try and achieve them. Please can you be on board just to help me, not being needy and like trying to be the favorite or anything, but again, just communicating that to you, and then you having the awareness to help them achieve that. It's those simple things that it creates a two-way channel of communication, and that you're all on the same page, heading in the same direction. I think it's really helpful. Absolutely.
And I also think there's this connection that gets created around that as well. Because it's in the moment, it's real time, and that it's personalized, and that becomes really important. That's again another advantage to using a strengths-based approach, just in terms of understanding what people need and understanding when they're not at their best. I mean, again, the basement of achiever is going to be win at all costs, and I'm going to sacrifice everything to get this right, and that's not necessarily good in a team context, especially in a training situation. So understanding where the player may fall down is also useful in terms of helping them be aware of where they are and how they can stay engaged on where they need to be in terms of what the team needs at that moment.
And managing their expectations. Gareth, in a tournament, so say you're away on tournaments, if it's locally or away, what is a legitimate stress relief for a player, and what is not?
So, I mean, that's a really good question, Joe, because you're away for a long time, you're in relatively confined circumstances, you're in a very routine-driven space, and rest and recovery are really important, and that's both physical and mental. So players do need, or athletes and coaches do need a way of finding and creating some space, recharging their batteries. The question, I think, is that it's unique to everybody. Everybody's going to have their own way of doing things. We've spoken about athletes who like to stay in their room with the curtains closed and relax and be alone in the dark. You've got players who like to take an Xbox with them on tour and play games and get little syndicates of gaming going. And then you have athletes who actually like to find more exercise to get themselves in tuned based on what they do in their normal routines. You have guys who like to explore. You have guys who like to socialize with friends from other teams and that kind of thing. And all of those things are legitimate and understandable. The question is, when does it start to impact on the team, and when does it start to impact on the individual? So too much of anything isn't a good thing. Locking yourself in your room and keeping the lights off for 14 days of a tournament is not healthy. Going for a coffee 4 times a day is not healthy. Playing tourist all the time is not healthy. So it's a question of what works and what doesn't, and it's all about balance at the end of the day. And it's also a reminder that at the end of the day, you are there to perform and you're there to compete, and you need to be doing everything to give yourself the best chance of doing that. including what you do in your leisure time.
And I think that's, again, about the boundaries and the commitment and the sacrifice that one needs to make for the team, for the common outcome of the team. So I don't think, I don't know, but is it the responsibility of the coach to set the boundaries with the players, or suggest boundaries with the players, or just bring awareness to what's healthy and what's unhealthy and what's suggested, or guidelines, or I'm not sure. What would your approach be?
I think there needs to be an informal contract in terms of treating people like adults, especially if they are adults, of course. We're talking about senior national players here, and letting them agree on what is and isn't allowed. I've often said, you know what, if you don't want to have dinner in the hotel tonight and you want to go and have dinner with a friend or with your folks or whatever it might be, 100% fine. Just let us know in advance. I would also rather set the boundary in terms of saying, today is a day when we're going to spend the whole afternoon feet up in our rooms, watching video and relaxing. Tomorrow is the day when we can get out, stretch our legs, go for a walk. So I think it's built into your schedule, it's built into your routine, and it's built into a respectful environment.
Yeah.
And I've even in the past said to a player who's feeling a little bit down on himself, or if it's a special occasion or he's remembering something, that if you want to go and have a beer, but
Okay.
don't have 5, have one, have it respectfully, and then carry on with your normal routine.
But Gareth,
so, boundaries and expectations.
Yeah, and I like the contract because it's sitting down with the player and doing a contract together, which means they're in on it and they therefore take responsibility for what you've agreed.
Yeah,
okay,
absolutely.
But Gareth, thank you so much for your time. And our next interview, we're going to cover the stress response and what it looks like for the high performance athlete, high performance coach, and how to manage that better.
Awesome. Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks so much, Joe. See you soon.
Okay, cheers, Gareth. Thank you. Bye. This was the second podcast or video recording. So if you would like to send a message to the podcast or to be included in future podcasts, please do so. This podcast is free and you can support it by subscribing to Beet It with Joe, and it's BEET, so Beet It for the beetroot, on the YouTube channel. You can also support by subscribing and sharing this podcast or YouTube video on your social media platforms. If you would like to sponsor a podcast, please do so, and you'll find all the information below in the podcast. The Beet It with Joe podcast is general information purposes only and does not constitute the practice of psychology, psychiatry, dietetics, or any other professional health.